Good afternoon and welcome to the panel, The Rising Tides of the South China Sea. In recent news, China has drilled in the South China Sea exploring natural gas. The Philippines has called out China on its assertive use of the commercial fishing boats, while the US Theodore Roosevelt Carrier Strike Group revisited the South China Sea, conducting routine operations and exercises, its presence reassuring its allies. The commander of the strike group 9, Admiral Doug Verissimo, stated, "It's great to be back in the South China Sea to reassure our allies and partners that we remain committed to the freedom of the seas." However, it's also reported that the Chinese strike group with the aircraft carrier Liaoning is now exercising in Taiwan's vicinity. However, it's also reported that these examples are just a few. These recent examples show the developments on the South China Sea, adding to the rising tensions in the area. But why is the South China Sea so important? One third of the world's global commerce passes through the water, amounting around $3 trillion a year. Fisheries account for 12% of the global catch. There are estimated reserves of 11 billion barrels of oil and 190 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. It is also important to note that the tensions first rose from the 1960s to 1970s, when oil was found, which gradually made countries move into some of these islands. However, it was only until 1988 where China started asserting its claim physically. The complexities can be described in three main points: the question on the ownership of the islands, the activities in the sea, or what you could actually do at sea, think like extracting resources, and finally the relationship between China and the US. Explaining China's assertive behavior and claim can be seen in its history, where it fought against foreign powers. One of the catalysts of the escalation of the situation is China's reaction to the Obama's pivot to Asia. China claimed that China's relations with Southeast Asian countries were fine, but also drove Southeast Asian countries further staking their own claim and China reacting the same. A key driver for China's assertiveness is President Xi Jinping, where he has exerted a more centralized control since 2013. One of the main worrying aspects is the militarization of the South China Sea. China has been building artificial islands through land reclamation and building military bases to exert its claim and to project its power in the region. To discuss this topic today, we are joined by Ambassador Minyan Tsai from the Taipei Representative Office in the EU and Taiwan, Lyle Goldstein, Research Professor, China Maritime Studies Institute at the US Naval War College, and Harry Nedalku, Policy Director at Rasmussen Global. I would like to thank you all for accepting this invitation. I would like to start with Ambassador Tsai. If you could provide your views or Taiwan's views on the South China Sea and the way forward. Ambassador?
All right, thank you, Jeffrey. It's a pleasure to be a part of this program. My gratitude goes to Atlantic Forum for inviting me and arranging such a good platform for us to share our views on the situation in the South China Sea. I think it's very timely and very important for NATO to pay more attention to the situation in the South China Sea. As Jeffrey just mentioned, South China Sea accounts for about 1/3 of global maritime trade and control the very important shipping line that connect both Indian Ocean and Pacific Ocean. So if there is a conflict or crisis situation takes place in the region of South China Sea, I think the impact would be very far-reaching, would be global reaching. It would not only jeopardize the stability and the peace in the Indo-Pacific region, I mean the whole region, but also endangers the normal operation of our international trade. So in such cases, I think NATO would be not able to ignore or to stand aside from the situation. And the reason why the situation in South China Sea has become highly uncertain, I think it's because of China. Because China is a rising power, and its behavior is becoming more and more assertive and aggressive. So if you look at China's policy toward the South China Sea, what we can see is that China has become more confident to show its muscles to the neighboring country and then to pursue its status as a dominant power in this region. So what do I think is that China is currently implementing so-called two-hand strategy to promote its political control and the military influence in this region. So-called two-hand strategy means that on one hand is hard hand, on the other will be the soft hand. And regarding China's hard hand strategy toward this region, China intends to build artificial islands in South China Sea. So far, China has built 7 artificial islands in South China Sea and moved so many military items such as jet fighters, air defense system, radar equipment to those artificial islands. Also, China has completed building airplane runway on 3 artificial islands, which would be able to allow China to operate all kinds of military aircraft and then to support full scale of military activity against the neighboring countries or third party if China chooses to do so in the future. So China also, try to conduct so-called Great Long operation by sending its Coast Guard vessels into those disputed water to expel or harass those fishing boats or energy exploration vessels from foreign countries such as Vietnam and Philippines. So you may know that early this year, China just passed a new law to authorize its Coast Guard to use force against the foreign vessels enter into the disputed water in surrounding areas, including the area of South China Sea. So through this kind of hard hand strategy, China will be able to promote its military presence in this region and to challenge the status quo and to change the status quo into China's favor. So that's the hard hand side. And if we look at the soft hand side, China also showed its smile face to neighboring country by proposing One Belt One Law, Belt Law initiative, and to offer financial support to the infrastructure construction in Southeastern Asian countries. So, by so doing, what China wants to do is to disunite ASEAN member states and prevent ASEAN from, creating some kind of strong position against China's military expansionism in the area of South China Sea. So it's a reality that it has become highly difficult for ASEAN countries to stand together and then to issue very strong diplomatic pressure against China through multilateral platforms such as ASEAN Regional Forum, ARF, because they are so divided politically in front of a powerful China. So if we look at the situation in the area of South China Sea, we can see China has successfully promoted its political influence and the military presence in this region. And the militarization, as Jeffrey just mentioned, I think militarization of South China Sea has become a reality that we have to face. It also caused a very big challenge, not only for the country in Asia, but also for the important actor around the globe. And I think that is the reason why United States has expressed its concerns over the stability and the peace in the area of South China Sea. And also, United States had decided to operate so-called FONOP, freedom of navigation operation in the water of South China Sea by sending U.S. naval forces to, conduct regular patrols in the water of South China Sea and also to carry out a military drill occasionally. And the purpose is to show U.S. determination, political determination to maintain the stability and the peace in the South China Sea, also to pay respect to the freedom of navigation and overflight in this region. And we know NATO allies such as France and Canada have followed U.S. operation. And later this year, some other NATO members, such as UK, Germany, and Netherlands will be following this kind of operation by sending their naval forces to the water of South China Sea in the second half of this year. So I think given that many NATO allies have expressed their concerns and have taken some concrete actions to pay attention to the situation in South China Sea, it would be the right time to for NATO to consider how to position NATO properly on South China Sea issue. But when NATO wants to go further to deal with the uncertainties from the South China Sea, NATO may need to think about a broader picture that is about how to handle the challenges and the problems caused by a rising China, so-called China challenge. If we look at the very important strategic document issued by NATO in last December, that is NATO 2030. In this important document, NATO has regarded China as a systemic rival and also made it very clear it's important to coordinate strategy and safeguard the security of NATO's allies in front of China. And also, if NATO allies are threatened by China, NATO should offer the capacity to offer, protections. So if you look at this document, we can see actually NATO has issued a very clear policy stance over the China challenge. So let's go back to the South China situation. I mean, NATO may have to think about that. When the South China situation is becoming tense, how should NATO, look at this issue? I know it may take some time for NATO allies to reach consensus on this issue because geographically, South China Sea is far away from Europe, and also South China Sea is not a traditional theater for NATO's operation. But I think NATO have their like-minded allies. So there may be a chance for NATO to initiate some kind of process to have more discussion on South China's issue in the coming years. And if I may, I will just offer two humble recommendations for the reference of our NATO friends. My first recommendation is that in the coming years, NATO may want to consider to have more security dialogues or consultation with like-minded friends or like-minded partner in the Indo-Pacific region, so as to know more about the real situation. I mean, the security situation in Indo-Pacific in terms of the security situation in South China Sea. And Taiwan is a like-minded friend of NATO. We stand ready. We stand ready to share our observation and perspective about the maritime security environment with our European friends. So that is the first recommendation I would like to offer for our NATO friends. And the second one is that within the NATO system, NATO colleagues may want to consider to have more internal discussion or debates on South China's issue. And it may be able to start with working out some different scenarios that may take place in the area of South China Sea, and then to evaluate the impact of those different scenarios on the interest and security of NATO allies. By so doing, NATO will be able to enter into a kind of process to have more discussion on South China's issue, and then to have some more, I'm not going to say consensus, but some more common understandings on how to position NATO on South China's issue. I know NATO has attached great importance to NATO 2030. So looking into the next 10 years, when NATO want to capture the global security posture, South China's issue is not supposed to be ignored by our NATO colleagues. And also in the next 10 years, NATO may have to look at the South China's issue more seriously than ever. To conclude, I just want to offer one more point. That is, it's always very important to think about the unthinkable before a crisis, instead of doing damage control in the aftermath of a crisis. So I think South China's issue will be one of the cases, and I just offer some of my thoughts in this regard for the reference of our NATO colleagues for the consideration, and I'm going to end on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, the next presentation is from Lyle. Lyle, the floor is.
Okay, wonderful. Nice to meet everyone. I guess you'll put up my slides then? Is that? Okay. Unfortunately, I can't see them, but I guess I will. We'll trust each other that they're working well. It's really a pleasure to be here to join this discussion. It's a great topic. You can see on my first slide, I have a on the left there. You can see this. It's actually a stamp of that commemorates Zheng He's fleets and his foray that actually left from China to explore and trade with the whole of the Indian Ocean into the Middle East and Africa. This was 600 years ago, last month. So, to me, that's actually not a bad framing for this new world we're entering into, where perhaps it's not so strange that China has the largest navy. Back then, its navy was by far the largest and most powerful in the world. So, in some respects, we could be going back to normal. But so let me throw that out as a first provocative idea. But we certainly, there's a lot of tension in the South China Sea, and I'll try to give a few insights from my perspective. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Slide 2. And there you see, I actually read Russian as well as Chinese, and the Russians are following this with great interest. And this headline is about the French submarine recently going into the South China Sea, and you can bet the Russians are pretty happy about that. Actually, I would think, but it does, unquestionably, these new deployments are making headlines around the world. In fact, if you go to the next slide, the slide 3, where you have the 4 squares, I think. Right there, I'm actually working on a book on Russia-China relations, so I'm very intrigued by how all these geopolitical issues are impacting the China-Russia relationship, and that includes the South China Sea. And let's go to slide 4. Okay, another Russian article. Well, this, I did want to mention, I saw that the last panel was on the Arctic, so I couldn't help but throw this slide in. This talks about, this is a Russian strategist actually talking about what would happen if the Russians were to allow Chinese deployments of submarines into the Arctic, and what that would mean for U.S. national security. So I just want to throw out there also that the Russia-China relationship is clearly accelerating. This is a challenge for NATO, unquestionably, but it could get a lot worse than it is right now. And I'm afraid that may be where we're headed. Let's go to the next slide then. You have a couple of pictures of ground forces there. And indeed, when we think about Chinese power, Chinese military power, certainly over the last few decades, we've thought about China as a land power mostly, fighting the U.S. Pretty much to a draw in Korea, of course. But now things are changing, and let's go to the next slide there. Here you have 4 pictures from 6 April 2021. So this was just the other day, and I try to watch Chinese military news every night. And you can see that, no question in my mind that, we may want to talk about the South China Sea, and South China Sea is very important, that China is very focused on Taiwan right now, the Chinese military, that is. So let's also keep that in mind. And you can see the related focus on amphibious warfare. All right, and let's go to the next slide then, where you see the shipyard. That would be slide 7. And here, I just want to set myself a timer here. I don't want to talk your ears off here. So this shipyard, this picture was taken not long ago, flying over Shanghai. I think somebody just turned to the side and looked out the window, and it just gives a kind of stunning view on just how much is going on in Chinese shipyards these days. It's truly remarkable, and they have really stepped up the rate of building warships. Let's go to the next slide then, where you see the cruiser doing the underway replenishment. And this is the Type 055. I've done a lot of work in studying this vessel, and I think we have to say, and let's go to the next slide even. There you see a kind of internal cutaway. You see some of the weapons on this warship, Type 055. Really a fierce array of weaponry. And I have to say, from the U.S. Navy perspective, that some of these missiles are actually superior to what our frontline surface combatants have. And in any case, there's little doubt that this warship, the Type 055, is quite on par with our top line surface combatant. Okay, let's move ahead. Next slide then, and here you see a row of destroyers and a Coast Guard ship in the corner. Slide 10. I want to make the point, though, that it's not just about capital ships, carriers, and cruisers, expensive items like that. It's also China is turning the military balance by building a lot of small and very capable ships like these small frigates, the Type 056. And as you know, and I hope we'll talk about some, really, in some ways, China's whole strategy in the South China Sea now depends largely on the Coast Guard. And it's just over the last 10 years that China has built the largest Coast Guard in the world. Think about that, folks. It's quite a stunning development, unquestionably. And some of my research, including this graphic here, reveals that the Coast Guard can be upgraded within a couple of weeks to assume a warfighting role, including anti-submarine warfare, for example. Okay, let's move ahead. We'll just keep looking at different dimensions of Chinese naval power. So here you should, here you see, you should see a picture of the aircraft carrier right on deck. Looks familiar to people familiar with the U.S. Navy. Our carriers are still well ahead. It'll be interesting to see what the next version looks like. Still, I must say it's remarkable how far China has come with respect to carrier aviation. It's taken us a bit by surprise how fast they're moving. Let's go to the next slide, 12. You can see, though, it's not just in carrier aviation where China's pushing ahead. All across the board, from bombers. And by the way, you see the red circles there. That's the YJ-12, a very difficult weapon to deal with, a supersonic anti-ship cruise missile. But you could see other areas here like ASW helos. They're also moving ahead. Next slide should be 13. And we're looking at the Submarine Force. And they've just upgraded the facilities at Huludao where they build nuclear submarines. And we expect the next generation of nuclear submarines to be quite impressive. There is a gap here for sure. But boy, that the new nuclear submarines look an awful lot like ours. And their capabilities have been improving quite a bit. Next slide. I have looked in particular at the Chinese Submarine Force. Here you're looking at, I think, a national interest article. And this paper I found by specialists at the Submarine Academy. They're called Several Thoughts on Advancing the Submarine Force. That's an incredible article worth looking at. I've written an analysis up, but that shows that the Chinese have major ambitions to have their submarine force patrolling not just the Arctic, but also the Atlantic. You heard me right, folks, the Atlantic, and I'll come back to that point. Let's go to the next slide. Here I do quite a bit of work on undersea robots, and the Chinese are moving ahead in that area as well. So that's a big concern. I can talk about that if people are interested. Next slide. But there, it's more than just the naval forces. Of course, it's the missile forces. And here you see a DF-26, which is clearly labeled as an anti-ship weapon. This is the first anti-ship ballistic missile in the world. And yes, this is a major problem for the U.S. Navy. We can talk about this more. Now there's even an upgraded, longer range variant. Let's go to the next slide, which shows DF-17. This is the one of the first hypersonic weapons deployed. You may have just heard the U.S. had a failed hypersonic test the other day. China has deployed a hypersonic weapon. You see the odd shape of this missile. It's meant to skip off the atmosphere. Okay, this is a problem. Next. And let's not forget more, quote, mundane areas of naval warfare like mine warfare. And here I've shown that they have really looked very hard, that is the Chinese, on Russian military doctrine as regards mine warfare. And in particular, I want you to note in the bottom right corner, if you can, the article that shows how mines are to be used against submarines. And I think that is a major issue as we confront China's Navy. Let's go to the next slide where you see a picture of China Quarterly. Here's something you may want to Google and just take a look at, an article I published. It kind of gives my overall view of the naval balance in the Pacific. But I'm quite pessimistic, folks. So take a look at that, and you can. I'll be interested to debate those issues. But I'm probably more pessimistic than most. Let's go to the next slide. I just want to say one or two words on Taiwan because I really do feel that this is the powder keg of the moment. So here you see a couple of pictures with just a shot of Michael Beckley's book recently. And I have a bit of a debate about Beckley because Beckley argues basically that Taiwan is quite defensible. It probably, in his view, can defend itself, doesn't really need much help from the United States. But I disagree with that. I think Taiwan's extremely hard to defend and that China is very close to tipping that balance completely. Let's go to the next slide where you see Hilo. And here you can see, this is one of the ways that China is overturning that balance across the strait. Just a huge number of now attack helicopters, transport helicopters that make this into a kind of 3D scenario where they're able to use their air power actually to conquer the island. Next. And just on this slide, I would just, if you can see the rocket artillery here and some of the missiles, but China would have put tremendous firepower against the island of Taiwan, which is, should be very disturbing to everybody, including people on Taiwan, no less. But this really is a apocalyptic type scenario. I would urge everyone to look at it very closely. But we are focused on the South China Sea. Let's go to the next slide here. This is, let's see, number 23. Sorry, I'm not used to having somebody else turn my slides. But here you see there's a kind of sketch of the island battle. You can see an aircraft carrier burning, and something Americans like to see, or anybody, I think. But, unfortunately, pretty accurate rendering of everything else, let's say, where you see these overlapping kinds of defense rings and range arcs are all accurate. And the major buildup of reefs, of course, is the big story. Let me just check the time here. Right, I'll start wrapping up here. But look, a lot of this is about the law of the sea, of course. And I don't know if you heard just the other day, the U.S. Navy had a run-in with the Indians on this issue of law of the sea. So, there are some gray areas here, but I think everybody agrees that China has stepped over several lines. Let's go to the next slide. And here you see a debate going back several years in Chinese that was whether or not China should try to control the Malacca Strait. And what's remarkable here in this little debate is that you can see that they actually argued also against that, meaning there were Chinese who thought at that time, this is back in 2007, that China should not try to control, that it's beyond China power, and that would be too aggressive. Well, let's go ahead. Here you see, I think it was mentioned in the startup here that the Obama administration started to pivot. And it's true, and that's when tensions were starting to get bad. This was about 2011, and let's go to the next slide. Here you see from 2013 an article I looked at where this article really states very clearly that based on the Scarborough Shoal incident, that China would enact a new model where it would be much more, in their terms, proactive. Okay, let's go to the next slide. And here, same article, but here they say very clearly this is about China. China has the military instruments, but it's going to try to use non-military instruments, and that's what we've seen, of course. So they're being pretty honest here with their new approach. Let's go to the next slide. There was that major incident where literally hundreds of vessels faced off in 2014 between Vietnam and China. A lot of ships bumping at that point. Fortunately, to my estimate, they were very close to a war there. Let's go to the next slide. This would be slide 30. I think probably all of you are very familiar, have seen the satellite photos and whatnot. So these bases are extremely, extensive, elaborate. One thing I will say, though, they have not moved a vast fleet of aircraft down there yet. Now, they may be just looking for an excuse, but they have not gone ahead with that step. So they seem to be holding that back. We'll go to the next slide, 31 here. Just shows some of the reactions here. As Shending Li, a famous strategy, says, hey, don't lecture us on international law. You guys, killed hundreds of thousands in Iraq, and we don't want to hear it. So, pretty much they basically ignored the judgment of the world there in 2016. Next slide. So if we think about what are the reasons for China's strategy, one part of it is clearly this Maliujia Kunju, meaning they call it the Malacca Dilemma. And that is the fear that China might be cut off from resources in the Middle East, Africa. That's an issue. Here you see that in this slide here that talks about that. It talks about the Kra Canal. And let's go to the next slide, 33. A bit more evidence here. This shows also how the Malacca Strait and security across the Belt and Road becomes a kind of rationale for a lot of what China is doing in the South China Sea. Let's go to the next slide, 34. Just a couple more slides. Sorry if I'm going on a little here, but let's see, in 34, slide 34, interesting. Suggests maybe if you look on the quote in the upper right that China actually may not view the oil and gas as that essential. I think this is very interesting to look at, a kind of countercurrent there. So the economic rationale may be more about transport routes and less about the oil and gas there. Next slide, 35. Let's not neglect also the nuclear strategy aspect, right? A lot of China's larger submarines with nuclear weapons, the SSBNs, the boomers, have gone to the south, and I think that is an aspect of this that we want to keep in mind. Next slide, please. Now, I do want to say there has been some nuclear signaling related to the crisis when Trump administration spokesman here said, the U.S. may block the island, the pathways out to the South China Sea. China started to, roll out its DF-41 up north. You can see some graphics related to nuclear simulations in Chinese. That's quite disturbing. I think we can all agree. Let's go to slide 37. Here's some discussion about how the Chinese view us putting nuclear weapons, small yield nuclear weapons back on submarines. Guess how the Chinese are going to react? Probably putting their own low yield nukes on submarines. That's the nature of Cold War, folks. It's not pretty. Let's go to the next slide here. Here, I would just say that to me, it's if you're looking at this, I'm just about done. But this is a discussion of Taylor Fravel's work, where he showed that China had negotiated in difficult circumstances. So let's keep that in mind. And the next slide, 39. Here is a newscast, and I just want to say, we talk about NATO's movement of warships into the East Asian context. This did occur before in 2017 related to the Korea crisis, and China was quite skeptical, of course. Okay, next slide, 40. Maybe the most important slides I want to show you. These have to do with the so-called Atlantic strategy that China is forming up. Okay, yes, China is forming up a strategy for the Atlantic, and NATO needs to be aware of this. So let's look at, this is quite an important journal they published in. And so let's go to the next slide, 41, where analyze this a little bit. But if you look in the upper right-hand corner, it says, that they're very concerned about the South China Sea problem. The upper left, it says they see themselves dealing with an American maritime blockade. And then if you go to the next slide here, it talks about how on the bottom right, that quote, it says, we'll have to put pressure on the United States to give them misgivings about interfering in China's proximate seas. So, again, sounds a lot like a Cold War. And then, okay, there's my timer telling me to be quiet. Excuse me. So, final couple slides here. The slide 43 that's, if people are interested in the military balance, you probably want to read this, the military scorecard. I have a lot of critique, though. I think, again, it was excessively optimistic. And then slide 44, pretty much my last slide, is I just make sure people know that there's a lot of Chinese hawks out there, including this one, who is just openly advocating for the use of force, to teach those barbarians a lesson. So, I think we're lucky to have avoided conflict so far. And I think, I could talk more about my recommendations. I didn't get to those, but my chief recommendation is that we need to act very cautiously. I'll stop there. Thank you. And sorry for going on a bit long.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jeffrey, and thank you for inviting me to the conference and having me on this panel. It's a real pleasure, and it's a real privilege. I'd like to maybe structure my presentation into three bits. One on what NATO's role and the possible role of NATO allies could be in the South China Sea. Then one focusing on Europe and what the EU could do in the broader region, and then finally on the role of democracies writ large, more broadly, on dealing with China more holistically, the military, but also, of course, the economic and on the political side. So first on NATO, and here a lot of it is contingent on the United States. The United States has been pivoting for some time to the area, and more specifically now, speaking about Taiwan, has been shifting or is thinking to shift its policy from strategic ambiguity, which has been the U.S. policy for quite some time now, which is to say, the U.S. has an agreement that is a defensive agreement with Taiwan, but hasn't spelled out exactly how it would basically operationalize that if under threat. This is changing now. this policy shift is happening now in DC, one from strategic ambiguity to one that is about strategic clarity, that yes, if Taiwan should come under threat, the United States would come to its aid. So in this context, one specific thing that NATO allies, especially European allies, could and should do is that they should make it very clear that should the United States find itself in a conflict in the region, then NATO allies would come to the help and to the aid of the United States, including militarily, making that very clear. Because ultimately, the one way to prevent a war is to prepare for one and deter aggressors from starting one. So that's one. That's on NATO. But NATO and NATO can do so much on the military front and security front. But then there's also the EU and what the EU could do to step up to the plate. And here in the EU, we see the EU coming up and contemplating its Indo-Pacific strategy. But we have two schools of thought in the EU. We have, on one hand, we have a French school of thought, and then we have a German / Dutch school of thought, if you will. The French school of thought, by very virtue of France's physical presence in the region, because France owns territory in the region, has territory in the region. The French school of thought has an important military component to its Indo-Pacific strategy. On the other hand, the newer German and Dutch versions of that, which have been devised also in anticipation of the EU's own Indo-Pacific strategy, they focus more on the economy side, on trade, maritime trade, environment. They have a very tiny, or they have almost no component that is military in their strategies. And interestingly enough, none of them mention too much the US in this context. So one thing the EU absolutely needs to do as it devises its holistic strategy to the Indo-Pacific is to include a very strong, robust military component to its strategy. And here, the French presidency of the EU in 2022 is a great opportunity to do that and to have that important military component there, especially as the United States is about to bring Europeans more into the conversation on the region in the Indo-Pacific, together with the other members of the Quad as well. That's on the EU side. But more importantly, what should be the focus of democracies in general in the world, European democracies together with everybody else when it comes to the China problem. And here we have to be very careful and acknowledge that China and the way the China problem differs, of course, depending on where you sit. And to a NATO audience, this is very similar to the way we perceive Russia. You're going to see it very differently if you're on the eastern flank as opposed to if you're a southern ally. And here it's very similar. We tend, the closer we are to China geographically, we perceive China from the prism of security and the military. So if you are one of China's neighbors, if you are Taiwan, Vietnam, Philippines, you will see the buildup of artificial islands. You will see the increase in military capabilities. You will see the aggression or the aggressive moves from China, entrances into their airspace or their territorial waters. So this is how primarily, and this is very obvious, how they see China. And of course, there's the economic side of things, but that is a reality that we have to live with. Primarily, it is about the military and the security. The further away we move away from the region, Australia, but of course also Europe, the more, of course, we see the military side of things, but the more we are concerned with the political and the economic side. And here it's important to understand these two are very intertwined. One derives from the other. They're not separate issues. We sometimes address them as separate issues. They're two sides of the same coin. And I would argue that the military aspect and the security aspect derives itself from China's economic prowess and the way China uses basically economic means to coerce, even politically, other states. And I'll give you a very specific example from Europe. In Europe, ever since the end of the Great Recession, China's strategic acquisitions economic strategic acquisitions in Europe has grown exponentially from 2 billion in 2008, 2009 to about 40 billion in 2016. Then it went down a little bit, but it's still quite high. And these acquisitions are strategic in the sense that it's not so much that they always make economic sense, but they definitely give China a lot of political influence. So for instance, a lot of them are acquisitions of activities when it comes to railways, highways, transportation nodes, of course, airports, harbors, and of course even high-tech and various high-tech plants and factories. So there's two ways in which this has actually manifested. One, the actual capabilities that are military capabilities of China have been in great part of the high-tech, especially acquisitions, have had dual purposes. So they're civilian. They have civilian purposes, but they can be put on or placed on military applications. We've seen that with the submarines and some of the helicopters they've had. So that's one way. But the other way, it's to basically change the foreign policy and the political stances of some of these countries. And we've seen that especially previously with the previous Greek government, where China used its acquisition of Piraeus, which is a harbor right next to Athens, a very important hub, in order to get Greece to water down the foreign policy position, the EU foreign policy position, when it used to come to human rights violations. So here we see the clear kind of link between this. And over time, of course, Europeans have grown a little bit more, and they've started to take a little bit more action. We've seen how they've implemented. A lot of member states have beefed up their foreign direct investment screening mechanisms. For example, they've built a screening mechanism also at the EU level. On 5G, the EU has issued a 5G toolbox, and many countries have increased their 5G network security. But we still continue seeing China's growing influence in other ways. So for instance, when it came to COVID-19 and COVID-19 vaccine diplomacy, we saw how China tried to puncture the unity of the EU by focusing on certain countries that perhaps didn't deal so well with the pandemic. So we saw China basically approaching Hungary and Serbia and selling its vaccine to them. And at one point, we even saw the Serbian prime minister kissing the Chinese flag with a big smile on his face, saying that the EU hasn't been at all useful, but thank God for China because they've helped us. So we've seen stuff like that. And we've seen the same type of strategic investments shifting focus a lot to the Western Balkans, which is a bit like the soft underbelly of Europe. So countries that are not yet EU member states, but could be one day because they have an EU membership path, and some of them, they are candidates. And we've seen Chinese strategic investment focused on that. And again, out of all the Western Balkans, Serbia is almost half in terms of the numbers of projects that China has there. So railways, highways, also some heavy industry. But there's really a Chinese presence in all of these countries. In North Macedonia, there's a highway in Montenegro, there's an oil field in Albania, there's some presence also in Bosnia as well. So we need to think more collectively how to deal with this problem as well, also as a means to then tackle the military aspect of it, of China's aggression, including in the South China Sea. So, and I'll try to leave it here. But one way to do that, and here's where NATO can be extremely helpful, not because of on its own, because it's not equipped to do that, but we can draw inferences from NATO in order to devise a system that can help us deal with China's political interference in our elections, and of course, economic influence. And literally that is to say, taking the NATO treaty, which is of course geared on for military purposes, but taking that and using that as a blueprint for establishing a similar mechanism that deals with the economy and that deals with the political aspect. So what I mean by that is, for instance, let's take Article 3, right, which is about either on their own or collectively, allies building their capabilities to withstand a possible attack. So taking that, extrapolating that, and establishing an international institution between Europeans, but of course not only, but also any democracy in the world, because we're all really affected by this. So all democracies coming together and building an international system that is better prepared, better geared up to deal with the political aspects and the economic aspects of China's influence. Then taking Article 4. Article 4 says if one ally is under attack, they then get to call the other allies, discuss with them basically what they perceive to be a threat. So establishing how that would look like in this case would be to establish an institutionalized framework, a body, a council where democracies could sit down, and if one democracy feels threatened, be it through cyber attacks or economic coercion, they get to share that information very quickly with the other with the other partners. And finally, and I really leave it here, and I'll conclude with this, and this is something that Anders Fogh Rasmussen and other colleagues have called for as well. Ultimately, the most important part in the NATO treaty is Article 5. So an economic Article 5, how would that look like? In case, for instance, a country finds itself under attack, but below the radar, that is to say, political influence or interference in their elections, or again, economic coercion, a mechanism that would basically be able to retaliate, place sanctions very quickly and effectively when China would do something like this. Or if, for instance, China would slap sanctions or tariffs, let's say, on a certain country in order to coerce it to change its position. An institution that would basically be equipped, it could be a bank that would have a pool of money that would basically be able to come to the aid of that democracy that is being coerced. So in this case, and I'll leave it here, NATO, of course, aside from the military aspect, NATO has, I think, a very strong role to play as, the most successful alliance ever created in being a source of inspiration for us more broadly. And when I say us, I mean every democracy in the world, to use the experience of NATO, but apply it to a political and to the economic side of this problem. So I thank you very much, and I leave it here, and I'm looking forward to the questions.
Now I would like to introduce Rebecca Heinrichs, the Senior Fellow from the Hudson Institute. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Privileged to be able to join this distinguished panel. I benefited from the previous remarks, and I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to do my best to avoid repeating some of the points already made and fill in where I think would benefit the discussion. Knowing that the topic of the discussion is the South China Sea, I still think that the primary issue before us that is certainly the most important to the United States is Taiwan, and that Taiwan is going to be or is likely to be the flashpoint in the entire region. And so my remarks are actually primarily focused on what to do about that issue, because obviously it directly impacts the South China Sea and what China is doing there. But before I get to Taiwan, I wanted to zoom out a little bit and then provide some larger context for how I've been thinking about this, and certainly how senior military officers have been communicating to the U.S. Congress, and how the discussion about China geopolitically is really being discussed here in the United States among scholars and analysts, and then members of Congress and staff and members of Congress, and what's really preoccupying our thoughts and our conversations about this. And this is really the Obama administration began to talk about, try to do this shift to the Pacific, the pivot that never really was. It began a little bit, but that it didn't really finally take. The Trump administration really was the time where we began talking very, very seriously about great power competition, major power competition. And that was really about two powers, China primarily, Russia secondarily. But those are the two major powers that could pose the greatest threat to the United States and our vital interests. And then obviously with that, that means the other liberal democracies of which the United States has primary, close, longstanding alliances with them. And really it is focused. I'd be interested in tracking what Lyle says about the growing Chinese Russian military cooperation in particular, because I'm always challenging people to not to succumb by a failure of imagination, that we need to be thinking, all of us who have appreciated and enjoyed relative peace since the Second World War, that we need to be thinking about how small regional conflicts is how large major wars begin, and watching the big shifts in alliances and partnerships will greatly impact and affect how that plays out, and the results of what could begin as a regional conflict that grows into a much larger one. And so I'm always trying to track closely what Russia and China are doing. Really, Russia as the junior partner, they hate when you call them that, but really that's what they are to China, and watching how they're continuing their cooperation, especially militarily, and why that's significant, even all the way as it pertains to Iran, seeking to undermine the United States and U.S. objectives in completely different theaters. But so why are we so focused on China now? And I would just say it is really because over the last several decades, the West, mainly the United States, and our allies, really hoped and were banking on, and this was a bipartisan assumption, that as the Chinese got rich, became wealthy, and were integrated into the global economy, that they would liberalize internally, and so we wouldn't be essentially enriching and enabling what could be our primary adversary in 2021. Unfortunately, what did happen was that the Chinese Communist Party did get incredibly wealthy, and then as we heard a great presentation from Lyle, they took all of that wealth and they really invested it into a world, well, I won't give them that much praise, into a significant military power, especially their Navy, but it's not just limited to their Navy. I look at missiles as my primary area of focus in my research, and the reason I focus on missiles and nuclear weapons, and that's missiles that are conventional, that is non-nuclear as well as nuclear, is because that's how countries that want to coerce, compel, deter, dissuade major powers, that's their best bang for their buck, is to be able to invest in those capabilities. And really, China has invested in an enormous missile arsenal to be able to put it frankly, deny the United States access to that region, to hold our aircraft carriers at risk, to hold our bases that are in the region at risk, to hold our allies and partners at risk. And it's not just some of their, it's not just simple ballistic missiles, which are, I say simple, I don't mean easy, but I mean on this, predictable trajectory, which is a ballistic trajectory, but as already mentioned, cruise missiles and hypersonic glide vehicles. And it's a little bit of a misunderstanding about what these kind of missiles do and why they're so challenging for the United States. It's not just their speed. Hypersonic, you think, although they must be really fast, but ballistic missiles, especially in their closing velocities, can be much even faster than a hypersonic cruise missile or hypersonic glide vehicle. But the reason that they're so vexing for the United States and why China has invested in them for that particular, for the region, is because the United States doesn't have the ability to hold a track on a hypersonic glide vehicle, meaning to be able to detect the launch and then keep the track on that kind of missile as it's maneuvering and flying at hypersonic speeds. And so we don't know where it's, if you can't see it and hold a track, you can't intercept it, and you don't know where it's going until it's too late. And so you can see it's not just that China has been investing in a serious military, but they've been extremely disciplined in the kinds of weapon systems to be able to specifically push the United States out of the Indo-Pacific theater. And so the reason that the United States is so alarmed at the current situation is it's the geopolitical problem. We've gotten to the point now where China is seeking to push the United States out of the region, and we already had a great presentation about why that would be significant for the United States, 1/3 of maritime trade, obviously, but it's much more than that from the perspective of the United States, much more than a trade issue. And I'll explain why it is such a huge concern for the United States is that if the United States does not have access to the Indo-Pacific theater, if the South does not have, if the South China Sea does not remain peaceful, and the entire, all those international waterways actually peaceful with access, free and open access to those, that the United States would not be able to make good on our security commitments to our allies that we have in that region as well. That particular point is really what underpins American global leadership. That I know our NATO allies love to hear about this, but that the United States, as a preeminent global power, has been able to offer and have a credible nuclear assurances, security assurances to our allies in that region. If the Chinese have the ability to push the United States out of the Pacific, then it seriously impedes the credibility of those nuclear assurances. And so once you have that happens, of course, not only is I believe the United States truly no longer the global preeminent power, that China has supplanted the United States as such. And then with that, everything else that comes with it. You talk about diplomatic might and the ability of the Chinese to then have greater economic coercion, because it does come down to these geopolitical problems, and the United States would seriously be harmed if we lose access to that. So it's really, it is a trade issue, but more than a trade issue, it does come down to the United States' ability to make good on its security commitments, and then this is when we get back to Taiwan. If the United States can't defend Taiwan, I'm going to make a forceful case of why the United States should absolutely move away from strategic ambiguity and move to more of a position on strategic clarity. Then even if we have not officially moved away from strategic ambiguity, I think that it has essentially become a red line. And if the United States simply sits back and lets China seize Taiwan, it will be a serious, hard to express into words how devastating that will be to American credibility and what the post-World War II order and really since the Cold War II, what the United States has sought to do, not perfectly, but to set rules, for lack of a better word, and an order for how trade, commerce, travel, and just overall general freedom and prosperity for the region and then globally if the United States loses the great and flourishing democracy that is Taiwan to the Chinese Communist Party. And that's another point I want to make. Scholars tend to, we're sort of arguing with ourselves over here about whether or not it's just the military piece or the economic piece that we're concerned about, but and really kind of trying to keep the ideological issues, and the Europeans, the NATO allies, have their own way of viewing at this. I thought Harry made a great presentation about how different countries within the NATO alliance have disparate views, not just about the threat, but about how they want to even characterize the threat and how they want to rack and stack the problems. Some of them more on the military side, some of them far less military, and they care much more about the human rights or the economic. And I have tried to argue that you really can't completely separate them, compartmentalize them, because the reason we view the Chinese Communist Party as such a major threat to the United States is because their system of government and their system of government, meaning Chinese communism, but also the ideological underpinnings of that. Marxist-Leninism, which Secretary Pompeo, of course, talked about quite a bit, or tried to bring some light to that whenever he was Secretary of State during the Trump administration. That is what is motivating and driving Xi Jinping to make these major power moves in the region, in the South China Sea. It's major military provocations that have continued to increase, and especially to threaten Taiwan, but not just Taiwan, Vietnam, the Philippines, et cetera, Japan, and its militarization of those islands that it is creating, and that it is seeking to supplant the United States as the most influential and powerful country, and with that, if not overtly, try to get countries to adopt its own system of government, but to make them friendly towards. That is no mention of the genocide going on in Xinjiang. That is no mention of Tibet. That is no criticism of its terrible behavior of obfuscation at the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic, its continued lies about it, its blocking of critical information to the WHO, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That all of those things that they use economic coercion to censor and to quiet not just their own people internally, but other countries as well. You can see our wonderful Australian allies just took a beating from the Chinese with their wine imports because of Australia's bold leadership in pushing for open, transparent information about the origins of the coronavirus pandemic. And then the Chinese sought to punish them economically. So that's just one censorship example. But then on the military side too, as when South Korea agreed to host the American, it's called the THAAD battery and missile defense system, the Chinese punished the South Koreans by boycotting many of their products to try to get them to back down, to eschew the THAAD battery, and then also not to take on the second battery that the United States believes needs to be there to protect our own forces and also the South Koreans. And so you can see that the Chinese are becoming more bold and brazen in their willingness to use their economics to try to carry out their will in all of these different fronts. And then you've seen some of this with H&M, the clothing company too. Anytime a company begins to speak out, then you can see how on China's internal humanitarian atrocities that you begin to have problems that come from the Chinese Communist Party. And so it's not just about the United States fighting with China over this particular island or access over here. It has major consequences because the country that has that power and ability, both militarily and economically, then does have more influence into what becomes standard procedures and interactions between countries. And so that's really what we're talking about from an American perspective. And so what does that mean for NATO? Well, I'm to the point now where I think that not all of our solutions need to be institutionalized. And what I mean by that is we don't have to have a NATO solution to this problem. Because Russia, I think, is a very, very serious threat to the NATO alliance, and then our alliance can't even agree on to the extent that Russia is posing a direct threat to the NATO alliance. Just ask the Poles and the Romanians. And then you move over and you talk to the Germans and you get, I think Nord Stream 2 is one of the most devastating initiatives that could splinter the alliance, and yet Germany is still proceeding apace with that. And so we have our hands really full with what's going on right now with that formal alliance and dealing with the most serious revanchist power that's threatening the alliance. Now, that doesn't mean we shouldn't have NATO allies, I think, working with the United States to deter aggression from China, primarily against Taiwan, because I think that's the most likely flashpoint. And we have seen some cooperation, some freedom of navigation cooperation with the French and other countries, the Brits, of course. And so I would strongly like to see that, but each of these countries is going to have to be persuaded by what's at stake. And I believe that if you are a country that has benefited from liberal democracy, then you should certainly seek a close cooperation with the United States, the Australians, the Japanese, India, the Quad, those countries that are closest to the problem and that are increasing their military cooperation, their political solidarity, the visibility of their political solidarity to make sure that we are collectively working together to deter what would be, I think, a devastating conflict, one that we would like to avoid. And then just in my club, just going to close out in turn because I know everyone's anxious to the discussion part. I'm just going to explain quickly, if I may, why Taiwan in particular is worth the United States defending, and not for simply altruistic reasons, although those are nice, but because it is in the direct interest and it's a vital interest of the United States, and I would argue the free world, which is why NATO should care about this. And that is, China wants to take Taiwan for symbolic geopolitical and economic reasons. Taiwan stands as a rebuke to the Chinese Communist Party's entire agenda. Taiwan is a flourishing democracy. It was transparent to the global community when it came to the outbreak of the coronavirus pandemic. It tried to alert the WHO, the WHO, and the WHO wouldn't listen. It has been a beacon of a place to go from the Hong Kongers who are fleeing because of Chinese cracking down there with the security law. And geopolitically, we do not want China to have unimpeded access to the Pacific. That's from an American perspective. Taiwan stands as the unsinkable aircraft carrier. And so we certainly don't want China to take it for that reason. And then my last point on Taiwan is it is a great economic force multiplier when it comes to the global supply chain, and that is the semiconductor chips that are produced there as well. We don't want to give that over to China as well. And so I will leave it there. I can tell you what I think we should do then, moving forward to deter an act of aggression against Taiwan. U.S. military officers have been sounding the alarm bells in Congress that they believe that China could seek to move to seize Taiwan in the next 5 or 6 years. And so everything that the United States and our allies in the region and any other liberal democracy or otherwise, at this point, if you see China as the great threat that it is, I think we should be all hands on deck at this point to deter what would be, I think, a devastating war that would impact all of us. And I'll just leave my remarks there.
Thank you very much for your presentation. It was highly interesting. Now for the Q&A session. I'm going to ask everyone questions. Let's start with the ambassador, and this also goes to Lyle's comments as well. China in the past has attempted to invade Taiwan and failed. I think a long time ago, many decades ago, it was twice that they tried. But how real is the actual threat now? Lyle, you've mentioned Beckley. The Deutsche Welle, the media outlet, has stated that the Taiwan's army was ill-prepared in a sense of repelling an attack. So how real is the threat?
Yes, thank you, Jeffrey. I think our distinguished colleagues have pointed out a very good point. That is, when we look at the situation in South China Sea, actually there is a broader picture behind. That is, China is becoming more and more confident to show its muscles to the neighboring country, not only in the South China Sea, but also Taiwan Strait, East China Sea, and a common border with India. So how to deal with that kind of new problem caused by a powerful and aggressive China has become a very big challenge for many countries, not only in the region of Indo-Pacific, but around the globe. And Taiwan has been standing at the very front line against all kinds of pressure from the other side of the Taiwan Strait, because China has been using its centralized government system and to make use of all kinds of policy tools to put pressure on Taiwan. What we are now suffering from the other side of the strait have included China's military intimidation, economic seducement, China's diplomatic blockade of Taiwan's international space, also China's political infiltration into Taiwan's democratic and open society, and China's cyber attack against Taiwan's infrastructure components, and also use disinformation campaign to spread fake news, try to weaken Taiwan's democracy, and try to influence the result of Taiwan's democratic election. So if we bundle all those issues together, I think that is real threat that we face every day in our daily life on a daily basis. So what Taiwan is now doing is to take a couple of approaches to defend our democratic way of life. Number one is that we will count on ourselves to beef up our national defense capacity, working together with our American colleagues to make our military forces more resilient, more reliable, so as to deter China from moving toward military adventurism in the Taiwan Strait. And also, we try to make our democratic system more healthy, more resilient in front of all kinds of Chinese political infiltration. For example, in past few years, we have passed more than 10 regulations and laws to build a stronger legal system to deal with that kind of Chinese political meddling, political infiltration into Taiwan society. So that's one thing we are now doing. And also to reduce our dependence on China's market, we have been making every effort to have to diversify the economic partners. And that is the reason why we are now pursuing to have BIA with EU, I mean bilateral investment agreement, and FTA with United States, so as to reduce the risk of overdependence on a single supplier or market such as China. And the second thing that we are now doing, is to really strong support from our friends from democratic society. We should work together, and then we should share each other's experience. As I just mentioned, we have accumulated so many experience in handling with those new problems caused by China's intimidation. So as Rebecca just mentioned, Taiwan has been working very hard to become a force for good. We build a good model for the outbreak to prevent outbreak of a pandemic. We try to make a contribution to international community as a global citizen. So maybe Taiwan can share our experience and our good knowledge on handling that kind of China's influence operation in democratic society. Because I think that kind of hybrid warfare operation conducted by China not only target at Taiwan, but also other corner of the globe. And we should share this kind of information, this kind of knowledge with each other, so as to make our democratic system stronger for the future in the face of China's threat. So let me just end on that. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think the danger to Taiwan is extremely real. I think a war could start tomorrow. I've been watching this for 2 decades, and I've never seen the rhetoric at this level. And China has all the hardware that it needs and more. My estimate is that an invasion could be, they could conquer the island in less than 2 weeks. Really, more even than, even before the U.S. has time even to decide what to do about it. I'll have to disagree with some my colleagues here respectfully on a few things. First of all, I think if we junk strategic ambiguity, I think we're almost sure to end up in a war. China's made that pretty clear. Second, they seem to believe that we need all hands on deck. NATO can do so much. I don't agree. I don't think NATO can do much at all. I mean, as far as the forces that can be committed, they're negligible. And, to be honest, the Chinese are pretty much laughing about it. Not to mention, triggering some kind of a lot of old feelings that have to do with what the Europeans have been doing in Asia. One more thing, I don't agree that that Taiwan is the unsinkable aircraft carrier, or sort of the cork in the bottle of China's maritime power. This is an island 90 miles off of China. So, to me, I'm sorry, but I don't think this will determine the future of world order. This is just a family quarrel, to be honest, and I think we should treat it as such. By the way, I think people are remarkably flippant, or not flippant, but not especially serious about considering a war that could cost the life of 30,000 Americans, 50,000 Americans, maybe 100,000. That's, by the way, if nuclear weapons are not used, and they could be used. We've never seen what happens between a major power when major powers start employing nuclear weapons. We don't know what would happen. So I am in favor of de-escalation and diplomacy. That's what we need a lot of. I'm afraid if we escalate more, if we bring more powers, if we try to humiliate China more, we're going to find ourselves in a war very quickly. And this is a war, to be honest, and I'm mostly a military analyst, a war we're quite unlikely to win. Okay. When you fight a war, you want to be sure you're going to win, folks. I'll stop there. Thank you.
If I may hop in real quick, just to clarify my own remarks. Everything that I said about what I think the United States should be doing and thinking about is meant to deter a war. It is meant to deter a war. It is the Chinese Communist Party. It is China that is acting aggressively. It is China that has designed a military and a navy to push out the United States. It is China that is threatening its neighbors. It is China that is lying and coercing and using economic coercion. It's China that's engaged in genocide. And so I think that it's very, very important to understand that this is not just a quote unquote family quarrel. We have a regime that has the will and now the capability to do very, very serious, devastating harm to not just liberal democracies, but to all of the countries in the region. And I think we should take that very, very seriously. So what I have argued for is all with the desire to deter a major conflict. I completely agree that the United States is not in a great position vis-a-vis China militarily in the region because our focus hasn't been there over the last several decades. And that's why it's critically important. Admiral Davidson, the head of Indo-Pacific Command, has said that we need to rebalance in the region and quickly, that the tempo matters because we're trying to get ahead of this on the deterrent spectrum. And so especially now that the United States has pulled out of the INF treaty that prohibited the development of ground-launched missiles of particular range that we would need to deter China, we're out of that treaty now because the Russians were violating it for years. And so we should avail ourselves of the opportunity now to quickly deploy long-range fires, ground-based, into the region, again, meant to deter Chinese aggression. That's just one example, and there are many. That Taiwan has been doing exceedingly well at demonstrating that they not only have the desire to protect themselves, but that they want to have the types of military equipment they would need to make good on that. I think that just needs to continue all the more. And then the last point I'll say is on the strategic ambiguity point again. This is only because I've become more persuaded. I agree that it would be wrong for the United States to remove strategic ambiguity if it is not willing to back it up. Back up the clarity, which is why I believe they should go hand in glove right now. The Biden administration has essentially, for all of the tumultuous political season that we just went through in the United States, the Biden administration has carried through with great continuity a lot of the U.S.-Taiwan policy begun by the Trump administration. In terms of visiting U.S. ambassadors to the island, and so great things that we haven't seen since the 70s, and so. All of that is serious political signaling that is all but explicitly removing ambiguity. The more we do that, the more necessary it is for the United States to deploy the kinds of capabilities with our allies and partners that can make good on the promise that we would defend Taiwan.
Yeah, if I can add to that as well. I agree with you, Rebecca. I don't think this is a family quarrel at all. This is ultimately between what kind of system you want to have. Do you want to have the PRC's authoritarian system, or do you want to opt for democracy? On strategic ambiguity, which, by the way, democracy, which Taiwan is a full-fledged democracy. On strategic ambiguity, from a European standpoint, and that's the point I was trying to make, is it seems to me that this is already shifting the United States, and that they are going hand in glove, and that they are willing to say, yes, we are, and they're genuinely prepared to back Taiwan. In that case, NATO allies, and I stand by this argument, do have to make it very clear that they will come to the aid of the US and implicitly to the aid of Taiwan. Because we have to remember this, NATO is not only a military alliance, it's a political alliance. And we are strong because we've been able to deter, and we've been able to make it very clear that yes, Article 5 is something very serious that we stand by. It's not that Iceland doesn't have aircraft carriers in the Pacific, and for that reason, Europeans should not take a position on this. It's quite the opposite. Is to say that because we are democracies, and because we rally behind the U.S., which is a democracy, and Taiwan, which is a democracy, we stand together. And I think, of course, there's the military argument, but there's also the political argument, which matters, I think, quite a lot.
If there's a military exercise or a military movement within Europe, would that have an impact? So then can China block the port of Piraeus? Is that a legitimate fear for the European perspective?
I guess that question is to me. Because, well, on the first point, Europeans are already showing that they can project power in the Indo-Pacific.
The French show that. Lately, the UK has been showing that. And then also the Germans have shown that as well. Physically, yes, Europeans have already started to do this. On the second point about China using the economic angle in order to hijack any attempt by the Europeans, and that's the point I was trying to make to my presentation, we have to see these things as deriving from each other, and China's military might derives from the great capital it has amassed and its economic influence, including in Europe. And for that reason, I was trying to make the argument about a NATO treaty-like arrangement applying China's economic coercion and China's coercion when it comes to interference in our democracy. Again, because these things go hand in hand, and a lot of times, China's aggression is below the radar of military aggression, but it's equally potent. And we saw that in Australia with the example with the wine, and we saw that, of course, with some European countries that are being coerced. So these things have to go hand in hand. The NATO treaty and Article 5 has to be also backed up by an economic, if you will, or a political economic Article 5, ultimately.
Thank you very much for that. And then my next question to Rebecca, just please give me a moment. What is so of course we got a lot of American interests. We're also interested. I'm looking at trying to have an international solutions. What's the value of UNCLOS? Because we've seen the Philippines brought the South China Sea of arbitration. It says islands are just merely rocks. They're creating artificial islands. China. If we don't do anything, say in the next couple of years, or these islands will just grow and grow, and the notion of being artificial and like natural will be just completely blurred. So what is the current value of UNCLOS when China's just simply ignoring it? Oh, Rebecca, you're muted. Could you please unmute yourself? Sorry.
Sorry about that. It's very early here. Well, it's actually not so early anymore. 9:30. No, that's why I said I think that it serves as a useful tool to be able to show that China is perfectly willing to violate the standards and the norms of which countries have grown to expect responsible nations to abide, respecting the sovereignty of borders and respecting international waterways. What kind of behavior is again is expected out of countries that that want to participate peacefully, and China again and again and again shows that it's not willing to respect those rules or international agreed upon standards, and is in fact seeking to supplant that, and that they would supplant it because they have the ability to coerce and compel and simply to just bowl over other countries that simply disagree. So it's very important. It's just one component of a larger problem geopolitically with China. And so it's a valid point, and I think it's something to continue to point to and to try to the effort on the part of the United States and with our allies and partners should be to weaken China's ability to carry out its agenda, and that's a perfect example. One more thing, you mentioned that you want to look for international solutions. The United States has gotten to the point now where, even though this is major power competition or great power competition, that there's this misunderstanding that it means it's simply just a China-United States problem. But the United States now, after several decades, does not have the same kind of primacy that we once had and enjoyed just a few decades ago when China couldn't even see a United States aircraft carrier going through the Taiwan Strait, a freedom of navigation operation. Now they have a robust space layers, cyber, air, land. I mean, the Navy. And in wargaming exercises, the United States doesn't always come out on top, given the current dynamics, which is why we need allies and partners. This is why the United States is seeking, again, my focus has been primarily, it's going to be the Quad. It's going to be the allies that are in the region, because we need to have Japan's close cooperation. We have to have Australia's and India's. And then we need any other power that has the ability to bring to bear what the United States would need in a contest, all meant to deter, which is why the French do. Anyway, many of the European countries do have capabilities that would be greatly appreciated as the United States takes on this problem. So it is going to, it's not just that we want to have an international solution and a peaceful solution. It is required. We must. That's the nature of the problem.
Thank you very much. Now, to my next, as we don't have so much time, I'm going to give a question that's everyone could answer and wrap things up. But before that, I would like, I'm sorry about that. I would actually pose this question to Lyle and Rebecca. The Philippines has been a natural close ally with the United States, same as Taiwan and a lot of many other countries. The Philippines has also a geostrategic advantages in the region. I'm thinking such as Subic Bay. President Duterte, has strained the relationship, to say at least, over the past couple of years, especially with his internal policies. Could that relationship be actually improved under the new U.S. President Biden, or do we have to actually wait for the Philippines presidential elections next year to see far more greater cooperation? So I'm thinking for military bases, or U.S. the Philippines providing access to say the U.S. To be far more present, to put their military assets in the Philippines, to be a far bigger deterrent. Because I remember in 1991 is when all the U.S. military bases went away from the Philippines. Lyle or Rebecca?
Lyle wants to take that first, and then I'll, since I just spoke.
Okay, sure. Yeah, that's a good question, a natural question. I think you're exactly right that we do have a very strong bond with Philippines that goes back more than a century. I wouldn't compare it with Taiwan, by the way. We have an explicit defense treaty with Philippines. We have soldiers there going regularly. It's different from Taiwan, nor does China does not claim Philippines as a province. So it's substantially different, and I think Philippines is in considerably less danger. Most of what Philippines has been dealing with China has been arguments over drilling and survey rights and fisheries issues. By the way, Philippines and China are not the only countries to clash on fisheries. I think France and Britain regularly clash on fisheries. Canada and the U.S. and a lot of other countries clash on fisheries. So fish are a very complicated thing. You're right. Duterte has kind of gone back and forth, and I expect probably that oscillation will continue. The U.S.-Philippines relationship has a lot of very positive history, but it also has some negative history, and that creates a kind of group in the Philippines who are cautious. Myself, Philippines right now is starting to build up its navy and its forces, but I'm concerned about climate change. For example, the Philippines gets hit by these giant typhoons. Shouldn't they? They can buy frigates or they can buy hardening for their infrastructure so they can survive the next storm. So, to me, pushing and trying to kind of and serving the escalation of Philippines-China tensions doesn't serve anybody. I mean, they're next to China. They have to learn to live with China. We can help them. I think we need to draw a red line with China and say, of course we're going to defend Philippines, but it's going to be a defensive-oriented treaty. We're not going to defend every rock and reef, but we will, if by golly, if the Chinese decide to invade Luzon or Palawan, of course we'll be there for Philippines. Probably won't get a chance to talk again. So one last comment on Europe's role. I think Europe has a tremendous role to play as a mediator, but I think they're giving that role up by starting to put military chips in and formerly they could have really helped to ease the tension between U.S. and China, but that's going away. And last thing, there's a bit of moral hazard here, right? Right now, Europe doesn't have many ships out there. It doesn't have a lot of troops in these scenarios. It doesn't have a lot of losses. So how can you have a say or make decisions on war and peace when it's not your country that will suffer? Okay, so to me, personally, Europeans have a lot of opinions on China and a lot of opinions about Taiwan and so forth. But I mean, let's put it this way: if you don't have skin in the game, really, it's please just help as a mediator. Don't tell us where to get into a war or not. Thank you.
I would just say on the Philippines question just briefly, because I don't have much to say other than Duterte is a problem, and it's one that we might not have the luxury to wait until he has been replaced, and so I think it's just a reality that this is what the United States must deal with. I do think that it would be wise for the U.S. administration to focus on in dealing with the Philippines on these problems that are the most serious. I think we can run the risk of agitating other problems we have with the Philippines and their domestic politics, and we can unintentionally or unnecessarily create even greater friction between the two countries when right now there is a sense of urgency that there needs to be greater cooperation. So that's the only point I'll make there on the Philippines, but it's an important question, and I appreciate it. And if I just can. My last remarks I wanted to say, in addition to what the United States should be doing and leading our partners and allies in the region, greater offensive capability into the region to offset the imbalance I think that is there, but also defensive capabilities as well, especially the protection of Guam. That's going to be incredibly vital for the United States to be able to operate in the region and have free and open access. And so we need to be urgent in our deployments to better defend U.S. territory Guam. and that we should be working very, very closely and having greater visibility of our political cooperation and solidarity, because that is what is going to help impact deterring China from doing something that I think would be a serious miscalculation, and that is to try to seize Taiwan. And they have been using, sort of these gray zone tactics to try to wear out the Taiwanese and to try to make sure that they do have a weaker political will to defend themselves. And it's not even just in the kinds of harassment and interfering in their domestic politics, but all of the military operations that has caused Taiwan to have to respond to do these escorts of the Chinese aircraft. Taiwan has had to stop doing that to be able to preserve its own military capabilities in the event that it actually needs it, and so that's a very deliberate provocation and an act of aggression, I think, already on the part of China against Taiwan that we need to continue to watch. And again, the U.S. military leaders have said that if China does move to seize Taiwan, that the best conditions at sea to do that would be sometime in the spring. And so, although the timeline is 5 to 6 years, I do think we need to be looking very, very, very seriously at that problem in the near future. And my last point on how this isn't a European problem because they don't have skin in the game, I would just exhort my European allies and partners that they do have skin in the game. This is the difference between an authoritarian country that has the greatest geopolitical power and advantage in the world that's seeking to supplant the United States. And when the United States is fully supplanted, then there will be a domino effect. I think about what the United States has simply been able to influence and impact for the free world. And so clearly that is an interest for Europe. And so though Europe, there's other fronts besides the military front too that the Europeans should be looking at. The Brits have been great at eschewing 5G networks, et cetera, looking at that problem and making sure that they're not doing things that embolden and empower the Chinese Communist Party to the disadvantage of the United States and our allies and partners. So I would just politely disagree. I do think that this is an issue in which our European allies 100% do have skin in the game. Thank you.
Everyone, a last question. We'll just go through everyone. Please also keep it short. So I'll start with the ambassador, and I'll give everyone a chance to respond. I've seen a old presentation from Lyle, and I saw a quote. I'm gonna butcher the name, but I think you've done it many years ago, maybe 5 or 6 years ago. And it was a quote from Zhang Qinmin. He says he stated the experience of resolving China's border disputes on land and its inspiration for resolving China maritime disputes. So, looking at the history of China, where I'm looking at all the issues such as Tibet, I don't think it's the best way or the best way forward. But my final question, like if you're optimistic or pessimistic about this, can we actually negotiate with China? And do you think, can we actually find a solution that would make like the whole political world order happy? Ambassador?
Okay, thank you, Jeffrey. I think, China has assertive autocracy and try to explore its model for national development to other countries. On the one hand, on the other, try to have very harsh crackdown against different voices at home. So in the face of this kind of authoritarian regime, I just want to say maybe our good friend from our democratic family should, stand together and then to deal with those new problems caused by aggressive China. So looking into the history, we can see in the 1990s, many countries would like to improve relations with China through engagement. But 2 decades have passed. We can see, that kind of policy did not change China's behavior at all. So right now we need a new strategy. We need a new strategy to deal with aggressive China, and then probably our democratic society should figure out a very qualified strategy to hold a new situation. So I'm going to end on that.
Yeah, thanks for the point. Look, in the short term, I'm very pessimistic. I mean, the Taiwan situation is right on the brink. We need to pull both sides back from the brink. In the long run, though, I am more optimistic. I don't think, I don't think China's going to gobble up Taiwan, then lunge for Philippines, after that take Indonesia, and then go for Hawaii, and then California. No, I mean, this is just, this is not 1939 or 1938. And I would encourage people to look afresh at these issues. I think there's a very positive record of China negotiating disputes. That's what that paper was from Fravel, who showed that China had settled almost all the disputes along its border and settled them through negotiation. It's not to say China doesn't have hawks. They have plenty of hawks, but I think if we meet them halfway, and that was the title of my 2015 book, but if we will find a country that's very willing to negotiate. And by the way, even on the Taiwan issue, which is very prickly, sure, but go back to late 2015, and the president of Taiwan was meeting with the president of China, and they sat down together and had a very amicable discussion. So I think we can get back there, but it's going to take maturity and a willingness to take off these ideological lenses. I'm really rather disturbed here by the tone of which the whole panel seems to want to embrace a Cold War. I wonder if they lived through the same Cold War that I lived through, which almost ended the world several times over. So we don't want to go back to the 50s or the 80s, folks. So we can work through these issues. And, by the way, there's a lot of assertive autocracies out there too. Saudi Arabia, there's arguably Turkey, a NATO member, is an assertive autocracy. So, I mean, really, I think we need to lower the temperature, take the ideology out of it, and China has real security interests like any other country, and we got to take them seriously. And I think we can find negotiated solutions. So thank you very much.
Yeah, to the question of whether we can negotiate with China or not, absolutely. But it has to be done from a position of strength, and it has to be done from a position where democracies present a united front, and they're in solidarity with each other, and they're united. And by the way, this doesn't only go, it's not only true for China, it's also true for Russia. We have the same attitude when it comes to Russia, the same approach as well. The fact of the matter is that in this day and age, authoritarianism is on the rise. And it's not a given that democracy is the only game in town. We see authoritarian leaders getting stronger and stronger, and authoritarianism becoming stronger and stronger. So for that reason, and going back to the point about whether Europeans have skin in the game, absolutely. A democracy, and democracies in general, wherever they may be, have skin in the game. Saying that Europeans don't have skin in the game when it comes to the South China Sea or Taiwan is like saying that the US has no skin in the game when it comes to Eastern Europe security. Of course it does. And of course we have skin in the game when it comes to Taiwan or South China Sea or the US, wherever, because it's our ally and because we're democracies. So yes, of course we can negotiate with China, but we have to be strong. We have to make sure that we are negotiating from a position of strength, because that's what works. And we have to make sure that we are united because we're democracies and we have a common front. Thank you.
Thank you so much once again for the opportunity to be able to present my remarks. I just wanted to push back forcefully on this notion that both sides need to step back. Taiwan has every right to defend itself, and Taiwan is the one that right now is the victim of acts of provocations against China. And it's not just Taiwan. The Vietnamese, of course, the Japanese, in a variety of ways, are the ones that are abiding by the rules and standards of responsible nations. And it is China that is violating those standards. And so I think it's imperative that we have clarity, because we're not going to be able to come up with an approach that works if we don't have clarity about who the aggressors are and who are the ones that are behaving responsibly and normally. And so clearly it is China. It's China that, because of the system of government, because of the ideology of the Chinese Communist Party, matched with its capability to carry out the agenda. It's the marrying of those two things, the will and capability, which is why we're not all talking about Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has very, very serious problems. Turkey has very, very serious problems. Iran has very, very serious problems. But those countries do not have the same kind of capability and overall agenda that we can see coming from the Chinese Communist Party, which is why it's China, very obviously, that is posing the primary and most serious threat. Secondarily, Russia as well, to the United States and to our other democratic allies and partners. And so, again, everything that I've said here is to respond to clearly the signaling and the demonstrations by China that I think are unacceptable. And so we need to come up with a response in order to dissuade China from continuing down this path. The only thing that we can do to be able to persuade the Chinese to come to a diplomatic solution is to convince them that to not do that would be a higher political cost than they're willing to take. They're not going to do it out of the goodness of their hearts. And so that's why it's so important that there is a hard power component to this. In order for diplomacy to be successful, you must have cooperation militarily and economically and diplomatically and when I say diplomatically, I mean demonstrating political solidarity in all of these ways that creates an environment most conducive to have a peaceful diplomatic solution. We have not gotten there yet with China, and so because China doesn't feel like it has an interest or an incentive to do that, it's going to continue to go down its current path of aggression until it meets that hard wall. And so I would just encourage all of us to take that very, very seriously, so that we can prevent. We've got a little taste of what can happen with Hong Kong, and I think we should be doing all we can now to preserve the peace and deter the kind of war that none of us want to see.
Thank you. So time's up. So first of all, I would like to thank you for all these fascinating presentations and your answers. And it feels like we could talk for many more hours, but we don't have any more time. And on behalf of the Atlantic Forum, I would like to thank you all for taking your time to be here. It's very much appreciated, and I trust a lot of young professionals have learned a lot from this session. So thank you very much, and bye.